everyone, welcome to the Be Insightful in Technology podcast. I'm your host, Shai, and I'm also here with Byron to introduce to you guys a very interesting guest. Like, we have someone who is what we like to say top of the food chain, but we do want to, get his experience on things and just talk with him some more. So, we're going to let him introduce himself. Steve, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Shai and Byron. Glad to be here. My name is Steve Orrin. I'm the Federal Chief Technology Officer for Intel Corporation.
Let's talk about what is a federal CTO.
So it's a really good question, Shai. Fundamentally, as the Federal Chief Technology Officer, my role is to represent Intel and all of its technologies, capabilities, and ecosystem to the federal government and the broader public sector. That's the US government, state, local, as well as the ecosystem of prime contractors, defense industrial base, and the federal arms of many of the technology companies that are out there have federal arms that we work with to help deliver solutions and capabilities to the government. I like to think of my role as sort of a two-way street. On one hand, I help the government understand Intel technologies, our roadmaps, our capabilities, so they can incorporate them into their enterprise and mission needs. And then on the other direction, I help translate government requirements back into Intel speak so that our business units, our technologists and architects understand their needs and requirements for the federal marketplace. So in some respects, it's a lot of translation back and forth, but it also affords the opportunity to do some really interesting, unique solutions applying commercial technologies to the federal market. I like to say that I federalize commercial solutions.
That's interesting because this is the first time that I'm hearing about like federal CTO. Like we understand there are always people who intertwine, they get to interact with like different business units or different businesses. And we kind of forget about the government aspect between companies. Like I had an internship at my local sheriff's office, and there's so many different technologies that they utilize where you kind of forget that, oh, tech is here too.
Indeed, all of
So
their infrastructure does run on technology. It runs in the cloud. They have laptops and servers that service their particular mission and their enterprise needs.
oh yeah, and also we forgot to say, where can the people find you? Are you on LinkedIn, websites? Like how do you want people to look you up?
The best way to find me is on LinkedIn. So it's LinkedIn, and the slash is Sorin, Sorrin. If you want to learn more about our federal capabilities at Intel, just go to intel.com/public sector.
Okay, so we'll make sure to include that in the show notes so you guys can check that out. So let's get into the nitty gritty of the podcast. So how did you find your passion into tech?
It's a really good question, and it goes back a number of years. I've always sort of looked at the world of trying to solve hard problems. Um, Back in my early days, I was what you would call back in the 80s a hacker, not a malicious hacker, but someone just trying to understand how technology worked and taking apart systems and trying to see what makes them work and oftentimes what makes them not work. And then at the time, I was also very fascinated and interested in biology and research biology, and that's actually the direction I went in college and in early grad school was doing biological research and molecular biology. And then I got a really unique opportunity in the mid 90s to work with someone who was trying to start a company in the tech space. This was before the big internet boom, right before Netscape went public. And I thought it would be a sort of fun thing to do, for a short time before going back to med school. And after about 3 months, I just fell in love with the whole industry and the technology, and it was around cybersecurity. And it's much the same way it goes to my passion of, presenting yourself with a hard problem. Well, how do I protect email? How do I protect files? How do I keep the hackers out? Or how do I better improve the security that's already there? And so applying that sort of problem-solving solution approach to things has really been my passion all along. So after doing that first startup in the mid-90s, I then went to another startup and started it from scratch to, again, look at solving problems on the enterprise scale for mainframe systems, which, believe it or not, are still around. And then that led to another startup and another, and then ultimately got acquired by Intel back in 2005, and have had the opportunity to do some amazing things at Intel over the past almost 20 years now.
Oh wow. So you've seen a lot of things basically. What was it like between that transition of, that internet boom, like the dot-com bubble or whatever?
It was a fascinating time. Almost anything was possible. A lot of it, I mean, we all look back now and realize we didn't know what we didn't know.
Hmm.
But there was money flowing, there was opportunity everywhere because everyone was just jumping on the bandwagon. So there was lots of opportunity, lots of startups. What's interesting is I was on the East Coast at the time where you saw a lot of the tech boom everyone thinks was in California. But people forget that there was tech booms all over the country and really all over the world. I was based in New Jersey at the time when I did my first several startups, and there was a thriving tech community in the East Coast around New York. And one of the interesting things about that is you think about who are your key customers. Financial services, that's New York. You want to talk about insurance, you've got Connecticut. You want to talk about pharmaceutical and biotech, New Jersey. So a lot of our big customers were right there in the Jersey area, which made for a really unique opportunity. And also from a security perspective, it was a really early time when cryptography and firewalling were just coming into play, and people were figuring out how to apply these early nascent security technologies to all of the stuff that was happening on the internet and email, and ultimately that then led to the web and its transformation later into the 2000s. And understanding that there was a wonderful opportunity to try to help companies solve these problems early before they became as big as they ended up being. So it was an exciting time. A lot of the early conferences that we talk about nowadays, as have been there forever, were just getting off the ground. And so it was a great place to sort of network with your peers, although I joke that the early sort of Black Hat DEF CON conferences, there were maybe 200 to 500 people there. Now we're up to about 55,000. So it has grown a little bit over the last 25, 30 years. But it was a very exciting time. And you really could go off and do interesting things. And the customers were eager to adopt technologies and try them out. Many organizations were deploying things at the very bleeding edge because everyone wanted to be, out innovate the next.
Honestly, it sounds so crazy because like I was born in 2000 and I always hear about people that worked there, like they talk about the dot-com boom, and I'm just like, that must have been great to catch all that time. So, uh,
To add a question to this, what do you feel it is about tech that like gets everyone just like ranting and raving when it's like new breakthroughs and inspirations for new processes and stuff? Like, what do you feel like keeps tech exciting?
So, Byron, it's an interesting way to look at it. From the one hand, it's constantly evolving. So,
Hmm.
things don't ever get boring. You figure like, oh, we've all know the web, and then something transforms it, and we're into the cloud. Well, we all know the cloud. Well, now we're talking mobile. Every couple of years, there's a rapid transformation. So everything is all new and shiny again. Also, if you look at the last 30 years, it's how tech has really become pervasive through our everyday lives. If you go back even to the 80s, there were only a few computers that anyone ever saw. Maybe you saw a commercial for a Macintosh. All the computers were back in the glass houses and the data center and behind closed doors. And while it did affect people's lives, people were unaware. Your financial transactions, they happened on a computer, but you didn't know. Maybe you worked with you used an ATM, but you still wrote checks. So everything was still very much the analog world. As the tech transformation really took off, it's permeated our everyday lives. It became part of our lives, and we've seen it transform how we do business, how we communicate, how we learn, how we drive. It's become part of our everyday lives. And so that evolution, and in the scheme of sort of looking at technology revolutions across the past couple hundred years, the tech boom of the last 30 has seen such rapid transformation, as opposed to like the industrial revolution and some of the other that took years and years for them to become pervasive before everyone had a car, before everyone had a TV. Suddenly you go from iPhone to everyone's got one. And so there
Hmm.
the fact that it's constantly changing, that it's really become part of our lives. And so every time there's a change, it's a change that affects you. You're now on the cloud, you're using mobile apps, you're doing all these sort of transactions that paying with PayPal or other payment partner, not using money anymore. Those kind of transformations affect us, which is why it's so exciting and why it keeps changing every day.
Okay, I really like your perception and I appreciate
Oh, my pleasure. And just to take it a step further, when we look at this AI transformation that everyone is looking at as the new shiny object, the
it. Hmm.
transformation in the AI space is happening at an even faster accelerated. We're seeing, a year ago, no one knew what an LLM was. Now it's all the talk of the town, and next year it will be something else. And so we're seeing a faster transition as the technology and the computing power is brought to bear. to drive some of these new innovations. So I think that we're going to see this little hamster wheel we're on continue to accelerate.
And I feel like with the way that it's going now, like it's definitely making like us as a community in general smarter, like you said, with adapting to these new technologies. So I'm eager to see what the progression looks like in my lifetime. Like, but
Absolutely, I look forward to see how my children's lives will be, 20 years from now.
right. Because the idea of electric cars being a common thing now, I could never imagine back in, when I was born. Like I couldn't even see it being something that people were talking about, or like just hearing about like, the first Bitcoin and how it was actually prefaced back in the early 2000s. And now it's like all the rays and the craze right now.
Exactly.
Like with the change before your eyes is it really does make you think like how will adapt should people really become to technology and the key terms within it. Because I do think like we always talk about the generation gaps and the learning gap with technology that's still, prevalent, but as you go along, it's becoming you have to use this stuff to get by in everyday life at this point. So
Mm-hmm. So absolutely, and the learning curve continues. And I think even with the sort of the foes that have the have-nots in today that are in the same generation, we talk about the technical natives, and then you talk about the older generations that are still coming up to speed. We see that dichotomy of understanding fundamental how the technology works versus understanding what the technology can do for you. And there's a lot more focus today on what I can do with the technology without necessarily understanding all the bits and bytes behind the scenes that make it work. And
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of my history around cybersecurity, that's where a lot of the problems come into play because everyone's using it for cool things without understanding the risks that they're taking on when they apply these new technologies.
And I feel like there's something interesting that you said in our pre-screen is that like a lot of the technologies we use today, like there isn't, necessarily like a learning gap or like a knowledge barrier, so to speak. Like you just have to actually just work with them and try to come to an understanding of like how does it fundamentally help what you're trying to do.
That's a great point, Byron. If you think about it, in the past, you had to go to a special school, maybe get a PhD, maybe you had to work in the industry for a number of years to get access to and familiar with, coding and certain technologies. Now, anyone who wants to play with a large language model goes to chatgpt.com and you basically go play with the technology. You want to learn Linux? There's YouTube videos for it. Availability of these technologies and the learning and the training and the ability to start actually getting your hands dirty is really open to everyone. All you need is an internet connection and it's all out there, and a lot of it is open source and free to use,
Mm-hmm.
which really opens the door for everyone from elementary school to retired age being able to get access to the technology and figure out how they can learn about it or how they can apply it. And of course, you see the companies are looking for ways to help make it easier for people to apply technologies to their everyday lives.
is that how you help like basically bridge the gap between like Intel and the government? You're able to explain it in ways in the use cases that it
Mm-hmm.
can be functional between those different parties because that's one thing that I realized when I was interning at the sheriff's office. It is a lot of older people who are coming up on these newer technologies to implement into the government so that way they aren't like left behind. And sometimes it takes more understanding. So how do you really like bridge that gap?
So that's exactly that. You've hit on it at the nail on the head there. It's understanding their environment. I'm not coming in trying to make them understand how the silicon works in the chip. It's more
Mm-hmm.
understanding what, like we say, their enterprise use cases, the mission. You take the example of the sheriff's office, their everyday lives, whether it's processing people, writing tickets, doing lookups, processing evidence, or just the logistics of where to send the different patrols out. All that is enabled by technology. And so understanding what their problem set is, what their needs are, and then helping them understand how can technology either can make them more efficient or can do things that they couldn't do today or allow them to save money, all those different angles. That's what technology can do, but you can't start with the technology. You have to start with understanding what's their environment. And so in the federal space, it's spending time with the end customer, spending time with both civilian and military and understanding what their needs are, what they're trying to do, spending time with their experts, and working with them to understand what their environment constraints are, what their requirements are. In case of government, there's a lot of security requirements. There's a lot of specific, unique controls that they need in place. Understanding those, and then working to figure out how do I apply technology to those problem sets. And sometimes I have to create something wholly new, but often it's taking what worked really well at a commercial or another vertical and applying it. It's one of the things I really love about the federal market and the public sector in general is actually a microcosm of every other industry. If you want to talk about, healthcare and insurance, the largest healthcare provider is the Veterans Administration, as well as, CMS or Medicaid, the largest insurer. Those are federal agencies, and they're doing exactly what commercial equivalents do. Financial transactions, the Medicaid processes more money than most banks. IRS, obviously, with the taxes, they're all doing the similar kind of transactions. So I can take what's worked well in commercial, finance, healthcare, insurance, and apply it to the federal corollary. But even on the military side, making sure that tanks and jeeps and people get to the right place, that's a logistics problem. It's not a government problem. UPS has to deal with it. Walmart has to deal with it. Target has to deal with it. How do I get my inventory to where it needs to be? And how do I manage the complex supply chain? Those are problems that are solved in the commercial space that I can apply to the federal. The flip side is also true. If I can solve it for the massive Department of Defense, then I can definitely help a retail store figure out how to do their logistics as well. So it works both ways.
Thank you guys for tuning into the podcast. If you're at this point and you really like what you're listening to, go ahead and rate and subscribe and like the podcast and share this with other people who you think will find value in it. Let's get back to the episode. What are some of your thoughts, comes and concern on what's going on in the industry now? Like, what do you see?
That's a loaded question, Shai. Let's look at it from a couple of angles. I mentioned it earlier. AI is the sex. It is hot. Everyone, the hype curve is at full scale on everything AI and large language models, and the technology is evolving fairly rapidly. At the same time, we're looking at sort of the two let's call it challenges. Number one is how to best apply it to get the ROI. A lot of people say, well, all I have to do is train and model, and then they go and put it in the cloud and they realize, oh my gosh, this costs a lot of money and a lot of time and resources to get the benefit downstream. And so understanding the best way to apply, where do you get your biggest bang for your buck to use this innovative technology, where is it going to have the best results? I'll give you a great example. A lot of people are looking at some of the more sexy parts of AI, intuitive chatbots and object recognition and correlation and all these kind of fun parts, which are exciting and interesting and can do amazing things, doing generative imagery and all that stuff. But some of the biggest ROI is the, let's call it the non-sexy part of business, enterprise resource planning, HR, contract management, supplier management, vendor management, accounts payable, those parts of the core business that actually run those businesses. When you look at opportunities to apply AI to speed up those processes, reduce or eliminate redundancies, identify fraud, basically save money or do things faster, you actually find that those may have the bigger ROI for an organization because you can actually measure how much you've saved by automating certain processes or how much fraud you're able to detect in the banking scenario using these tools. So a lot of times the biggest bang for the buck is not the cool, how do I service my customers with fancy new chatbots. You actually find that the back-end systems are the ones that can get the biggest benefit. The other area of challenge is that, and we've seen this every time there's been a technology revolution, is security is sometimes an afterthought, or often is an afterthought. And it's not clear, how do I best secure these systems, whether it's protecting them from misuse and abuse, or in the case of AI, making sure that, if I'm training AI on my local, my current data set, which is my corporate IP or my trade secrets or my customer lists, depending on what your use case is, if I'm using an open system AI, that data can be now out in the AI that it's training on, and there are ways to extract that information, through prompt injection and other kinds of attacks. So how do I protect my confidentiality? How do I protect, or apply my ethical controls to something that is in many cases outside my control? And so there are a lot of unique security risks and challenges when it comes to deploying AI technologies that have to be considered. And it has to be considered very early in the life cycle. And I think that's something we've learned just about every time there's been a massive revolution in technology. We learned it in the early networking of PCs to servers. We learned it on the web. We learned it in mobile. We keep learning the same lesson, is that you can't bolt security on after the fact. It
Hmm.
works best when you design it in from the get-go. And the same is going to be true with your AI. If you don't have a good understanding of your governance, of the data sets you're using, the models you're training from the beginning, what you're going to get at the end isn't going to be easily securable.
Okay, so I have like a quick question on this. So how can people even implement security from the beginning? Because sometimes it's just about getting the product out there. Like,
Hmm.
That is we've got a term we've used that time to market will trump security every time,
Oh
and
yeah.
that's just a truism. And so there are multiple approaches that have been talked about how to actually do better there, and it really comes down to three things: um, making it a requirement of your product. So if you think about it, no one would trust a credit card system if it was completely insecure. So there's a fundamental requirement in those credit card transactions that they have to be secure enough to be able to protect the money that they're flowing. You wouldn't get into a car that hadn't passed the safety requirements. That those were built-in requirements, and so part of it is proper requirements definition. It's not that you have to be secure against every possible future threat, but you've got to build into your initial requirements for your product, what is that minimum level of security that has to be there for it to be a minimal viable product? And that has actually been, there's multiple white papers that have been published over the past number of years around, I think MITRE put out one called Deliver Uncompromised, and others around how do you make security one of the foundational requirements like functionality and performance.
Hmm.
The other, which is the National Institute of Science and Technology, or NIST, has put out something called the Cybersecurity Framework. And really, it's a codification of a set of ideas and concepts around applying risk to your applications or to your transactions. So instead of it be a binary of can I secure this app or not, it's about making the right risk decisions. You may have an app that you've got to get out tomorrow, and it doesn't have all the security you need. So how do you then layer security around it to meet the risk at this moment and then be flexible to change those controls downstream? Could be something like putting in firewalls or controlling access or requiring a higher level of security on the access controls like multi-factor authentication. Not always does it have to be I have to build the most secure product. We don't often have the time, but it's understanding what are the risks of that and applying the right controls downstream to mitigate the risks to the level of risk, and this is where the cybersecurity framework is really useful. You're starting with what is my risk posture? What am I willing to accept as risk? Not every application has to be secure against a nation state adversary.
Hmm.
Some of them, some of them just need to be secure enough against a 16-year-old hacker with too much time on his hands. And so understanding your risk appetite and then making sure your security controls match or at least a little bit exceed where your risk posture is what the framework helps organizations figure out how to deploy applications into their environment securely. And again, a lot of times it's not with doing a better app, although we'd love to see better applications, better solutions. It's around putting in the right controls that surround it or that are integrated into it and the policies of how that product gets used. And we're seeing that theme come up often again as we start talking about the latest craze. It's really the next wave of what's called zero trust architecture. Zero
Hmm.
trust architecture has there's a 200-page document that describes it in gory detail, but at its core, it's applying the right policy at the right time for that access. So moving away from the I secured it, I locked it up, and I'm done, to what's somebody trying to do right now and applying a policy based on what's happening at this moment. 2 days from now, the risk may change. There may be a new attack I didn't know, or the value of what they're doing may change, or who they are, where they are may change. And so being able to have a dynamic approach to security is really the fundamental part of what Zero Trust is trying to do, is take everything we've done before and make it dynamic, able to change in light of the real world. So that's, going back to your original question of, so how do we secure these things that are just happening so fast? It's building in requirements when we can, applying controls and policies when we deploy it, and then not getting stuck in the fix that this is it and I can't do anything else. Keeping it continuously monitored, continuously updated, and changing the policy to meet the times. Those are the tenets of how we're trying to secure things better going forward.
I'm glad that you mentioned that because it does feel like products are definitely getting rushed out to market. and we don't hear about anything until like some companies send you the letter in the mail. Hey, we've had a data breach, and we're just making sure we notify you.
Yeah.
I was trying to think of like the number of letters I've received regarding like data breaches, and like I don't. I guess how do you speak to like that kind of like awareness or announcement? Because typically when I like if it were my mom, for example, and she were to get like, your data's been breached, a letter in the mail, like, are there any steps that people can take in order to like assess that and see if they're actually at risk? Or, is it really up to the companies at that point to kind of do like a risk assessment?
So ultimately, your data is your data. At
Mm-hmm.
this point, if we look at the last several years, odds are you've been breached. There's so many records that have, I mean, there was a 27 billion record breach not too long ago. I mean, like the reality is some aspect of our data is out there. It's been breached. It's on the dark web. It's sad to say that ship has sailed. So the question is, what do you do about it? And really
Mm-hmm.
comes down to a couple of key things. And this is what I do. This is what I do for my family and for my mother and others is, number one is you do want to monitor your credit just so make sure that people aren't opening up accounts in your name. And that's,
Mm-hmm.
sort of a free capability you can do. You can lock your credit report. Those are simple things you can do just from the banking side of the camp. On the access side of the camp, it's, turn on multi-factor authentication. It's a no-brainer. We all have phones. We all have apps that can, they're most major sites, even the minor sites, all have the ability to have some form, even it's a text message validation to do multi-factor. Make sure that it's on not just for your access to get into the system, but to change the password. Make sure that one is also. So some sites don't have multi-factor for the access, but they'll have multi-factor turn on to change the password or change the account settings. And so just turning that on, and it's free. All the different applications, all the banks, all your healthcare providers, all your utilities, they have that capability today. It's industry best practice, but we as individuals have to use it. And then, on the other side, it's just, sort of good data management. You don't necessarily have to give your all of your data to Facebook or to social media. I don't want to pick on Facebook, but just social media. You should be careful of what you share because you know that eventually that's going to get out there. Even on sort of what's supposed to be private sites, that they can get hacked. So I like, like I say, don't put all your eggs in one basket and always have a backup, because the flip side is not just the data breach, it's also things like ransomware or data destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Your those images that you put into a photo sharing site, you want to keep those, have a backup, back your data up so that you can recover if something goes awry. Um, but ultimately, it's, managing. It goes back to managing a risk. We know that our bank accounts are going to be compromised. It's going to happen eventually if it hasn't happened to you yet. The banks will provide, so the tools, there's a certain amount of insurance coverage for your bank account of a liability that we have in the United
Mm-hmm.
States. That's a benefit of being in the US. Some countries don't have that, so there's different models. Um, but ultimately, it's doing raising the bar for yourself to a certain level, and then just best practices going forward. Don't click on links that you don't know from where they're from.
So, good real world example. What's your opinion on password managers? Because I tried to get more into this. Like, we have all these different sites with different security guidelines, different passwords, different, catchphrases to remember. So it's like that can be hard to memorize over time, especially if you don't want to repeat the same credentials for different sites. And it's definitely not, commonplace to write them down. So, what
Yeah.
would you, as a professional, recommend in that respect?
So I do two things for myself and what I recommend for others. The reality is, I mean, I've got hundreds of passwords that I've got to keep track. And there's no way I can keep those all because every one of them's got to be some combination of random numbers and letters, and it's too much. So yeah, a password manager, go with a good one that's encrypted, that requires you to authenticate, and it requires you to authenticate with two-factor authentication, whether it be the device you're coming from and a password or a token of some sort. Um, and then marry that with two-factor authentication. So I have a password as one of my factors, and then I also have like my phone or an app that generates a random code for my banking and for all those things. So it's doing both. But you absolutely, there's no way to keep track of all the passwords. And oh, by the way, every once in a while they'll tell you to refresh it. Well, now that one I thought I knew, I have to
Yeah.
update. And so getting a good password manager, and there's some really great ones. I don't want to advocate for one or the other, but there's some really good ones out there. Some of them are more integrated into your phone or into your browser. Some are sort of standalone apps. And there's a bunch of open source free ones as well. But things to look for is the database, the local database, encrypted? Do they require a good password and a multi-factor? You know, one of the ones I have, it's a password and a biometric. So I have to use my finger, and I have to provide a pass key to get into the database. And so just making sure that, because that becomes the single keys to the kingdom, and having a local store backup of that database, so that if your phone, you know, gets run over by a car, you're not hosed.
Pretty far in your career, and
Okay.
we want to talk about that journey and how, like,
We
a went over the constant concerns in the industry. Now let's get into like how others can get to where you are. You've made it pretty far in your career, and we want to talk about that journey and how, like, a couple tips that you would give others. Hey, I hope you enjoy what you're listening to. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform that you're listening on. And be sure to tune in next week to listen to the rest of Steve Orrin's episode. So we enjoy having multiple people on the podcast. We're very open to suggestions as well. Connect with me and Byron in the show notes, and also connect with Steve as well, you know, to get to talk to him, get to know him. But connect with us. Let us know what you're thinking. What would you like to see on the podcast? Thank you guys for tuning in to gain knowledge, wisdom, and understanding to be insightful in technology.